My parents humiliated me at my mother's charity fundraiser in front of the most influential people in New York. My mother smiled into the microphone, scanned the room full of donors and board members, and said, "At least Olivia found a husband, even if we still don't quite know what he does for a living." The room laughed. My father nodded along. My cousin raised her glass like it was a punchline. For years, my family had treated my husband like an inconvenience. Too quiet, too modest, too unimpressive to matter. They thought I had married beneath them. They thought they were being generous by letting us sit near the back. But then my husband calmly set down his drink and stood up. What happened next made a major donor freeze mid-applause, made my mother's smile disappear in real time, and made my entire family realize, far too late, why I had never once asked them for help, connections, or approval, because the man they were laughing at was never the one who should have been embarrassed. The invitation arrived 3 weeks before the fundraiser, tucked inside a heavy ivory envelope that smelled faintly of perfume and entitlement. The Reynolds Foundation, Annual Charity Gala, black tie, Midtown Manhattan. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable on the inside flap. "We expect you and Daniel to attend." Not "we hope," not "we'd love to see you." Expect. I placed the invitation on the kitchen counter and watched Daniel from across the room. He was standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the low, calm voice he always used when something actually mattered. Not rushed, not performative. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll review it tonight." He hung up and turned toward me. "Everything okay?" I held up the envelope. He smiled faintly. "That time of year already?" I nodded. Apparently, Daniel knew my family well enough to read between the lines. The Reynolds Foundation Gala wasn't just a fundraiser. It was a showcase. A carefully curated room full of donors, board members, and people who enjoyed being photographed next to generosity more than practicing it. My parents loved that room. I had grown up learning how to survive it. Growing up in New York meant being surrounded by ambition, but in my family, ambition came with a very specific shape: law, finance, real estate, influence you could point to, success that looked good on a website. Daniel didn't fit any of that. He never tried to. When we started dating, my mother asked me 3 questions in the first 5 minutes. Where did he go to school? What does he do? What does his family do? Daniel answered politely, vaguely, honestly. My mother smiled through all of it and decided right then that he wasn't worth the effort of knowing. "You're brilliant," she told me later. "I just thought you'd aim higher." Daniel never commented on it, never corrected anyone. When people asked what he did, he said, "I work in education." That was it. No qualifiers, no explanations. It drove my family insane. The night of the fundraiser, Manhattan glittered the way it always did, expensive and indifferent. The venue was a restored historic building with marble columns and soft golden lighting designed to flatter donors and hide flaws. Daniel and I arrived exactly on time. My mother stood near the entrance, radiant and composed, greeting guests like she was hosting a private kingdom. When she saw us, her smile tightened just a fraction. "Olivia," she said, air-kissing my cheek, "you made it." Of course I did, I thought. I always do. Her eyes moved to Daniel. "And you," she said. "Nice to see you again." He nodded politely. "Good evening, Margaret." She handed us our table card. Table 22. I didn't need to look at the seating chart to know what that meant, but habit made me check anyway. Back of the room, near the service entrance, far from the stage and even farther from the donors my parents actually cared about. Daniel leaned toward me. "Back again?" I let out a slow breath. "Looks like it." "Do you want to stay?" he asked quietly. "We don't have to." I looked around the room, at the chandeliers, the carefully arranged name cards, the people who had known me my entire life and still didn't know me at all. "Yes," I said, "I do." As we walked through the room, conversations dipped and resumed behind us. I caught fragments: investment portfolios, political connections, vacation homes disguised as philanthropy. At the front tables, my cousin Charlotte stood beside my parents, laughing loudly, already performing. She caught sight of me and raised her glass in a mock salute. At our table, a woman from the next one over glanced at Daniel, frowned slightly, then looked again. Longer this time. "I know him," she murmured, not quite quietly. Before I could ask what she meant, the lights dimmed. My mother took the stage. Applause filled the room, smooth and practiced. She waited for it to settle, smiling as if she'd earned every clap. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "It means so much to see so many familiar faces supporting such an important cause." I folded my hands in my lap and felt the familiar tightening in my chest. This was their world, their spotlight. And somehow, I already knew. Tonight wasn't going to be quiet. If you asked my parents, they would tell you they loved me. They just loved a very specific version of me. The version who nodded at the right moments, who didn't ask uncomfortable questions, who understood that some rooms were meant to be admired from the edges, not entered fully. I learned that early. At Reynolds' family dinners, conversation followed a predictable rhythm. My father discussed cases he couldn't name but wanted everyone to admire. My mother talked about boards, galas, and people whose last names carried weight. My cousin Charlotte filled in the rest with gossip disguised as networking. And then there was me. "Olivia works in nonprofit communications," my mother would say, already glancing elsewhere. "She's very passionate." Passionate. Another soft word. A safe word. One that meant not important enough to interrogate. When Daniel entered my life, that rhythm didn't change. It just gained a punchline. "What does he do again?" Charlotte asked once, swirling wine in a crystal glass. "He works in education," I said. She laughed. "Of course he does." No one asked what that meant. They'd already decided. Daniel never took the bait. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was thoughtful, precise. He asked questions people weren't used to answering, about impact, about outcomes, about whether the money being raised actually went where it was supposed to. My family found that irritating. "Daniel is very serious," my mother said once. Not exactly fundraiser material. That night at the gala, as my mother continued her speech about generosity and legacy, I felt that old irritation tighten around me again. "And the heart of this foundation," she said from the stage, "has always been family." Applause swelled. I watched Charlotte lean toward a donor, whisper something that made him laugh. She knew how to work a room. She always had. "And I'm so proud," my mother continued, "of the next generation stepping up." She gestured toward Charlotte, then toward the front tables where a few carefully selected young professionals sat, glowing under praise. I clapped automatically. Then my mother paused. The pause was deliberate. "And Olivia," she said. The room quieted just a little. "Our daughter chose a different path," my mother continued, smiling the way one does at a child who insists on wearing mismatched shoes. "She's always been creative, idealistic." There it was again, idealistic. "She believes deeply in causes," my mother added, "even if they're not always practical." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room. I stared at the tablecloth, my face warm, my jaw tight. Daniel's hand found mine, steady, grounding. At the neighboring table, the woman who had been watching Daniel leaned closer now, openly curious. She picked up her phone, typed something, then froze. Her eyes widened. "I knew it," she whispered. Charlotte appeared beside us a moment later, her smile bright and sharp. "Well," she said lightly, "this is all very inspiring, isn't it?" "It is," I replied evenly. Her gaze slid to Daniel. "You must be so proud to be part of this family event." Daniel smiled politely. "I'm proud of Olivia." Charlotte blinked, thrown off by the simplicity of the answer. "That's sweet," she said, then lowered her voice. "You know, these rooms can be intimidating if you're not used to them." "I'm used to listening," Daniel replied. She laughed. "Of course you are." She leaned closer to me. "Try not to take everything personally tonight," she murmured. "It's not about you." I watched her walk away, heels clicking confidently, and felt something shift inside me. That sentence, "It's not about you," had followed me my entire life. It had been used to excuse exclusion, to justify dismissal, to remind me to stay small so others could stay comfortable. On stage, my mother wrapped up her remarks. "And now," she said brightly, "let's enjoy the evening and remember why we're all here." Applause filled the room again. As servers moved between tables and conversation resumed, I felt Daniel lean closer. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded. "I think so." But it wasn't entirely true. Because somewhere between idealistic and impractical, between laughter and silence, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted before. My family didn't misunderstand me. They understood me just fine. They just preferred the version of me that never challenged their world. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if that version didn't show up tonight. As the lights dimmed slightly and the first course was served, I noticed my mother standing again, microphone in hand, scanning the room with that familiar, anticipatory smile. And something in my chest whispered, whatever came next was going to be different. I saw the message by accident. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. Not just what it said, but how easily it could have gone unseen. One glance away, one moment later, and I would have walked through the entire evening believing the seating, the jokes, the distance were all coincidence. They weren't. I had stepped away from the table to use the restroom when my phone buzzed. I assumed it was a calendar alert or a reminder from work, something ordinary. Instead, it was a forwarded text thread. Margaret Reynolds to Charlotte Reynolds. Make sure Olivia and her husband stay near the back tables. We don't want him circulating with donors. God knows what he'd say. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, rereading it slowly, like maybe the meaning would soften if I gave it time. It didn't. I locked myself into a stall and sat there longer than necessary, phone trembling slightly in my hand. The sounds of the gala filtered in faintly. Laughter, silverware, music drifting from the quartet. Outside, generosity was being celebrated. Inside, I felt hollowed out. When I returned to the table, Daniel looked up immediately. "You okay?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just slid my phone across the table. He read the message once, then again. When he looked up, his expression was calm, but different. Sharper, focused. "I'm sorry," I said without thinking. The word came out automatically, the way it always did. He shook his head gently. "No." I frowned. "No, this isn't something you apologize for," he said quietly. "This is something they chose." I swallowed. They've always done things like this. I just didn't want to see it. Daniel folded his hands together. "Do you want to leave?" The question wasn't loaded. No disappointment, no pressure. I looked around the room, at my parents laughing at a nearby table, at Charlotte leaning in toward a donor, performing competence and charm like a second language, at the woman across the aisle who had recognized Daniel earlier, now watching us openly, her phone face down beside her plate. "No," I said finally, "not yet." Daniel studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Okay. I need you to know something," I added, lowering my voice. "I've spent years asking you to stay quiet, to not react, to let things slide." He listened. "I don't want to do that anymore." Something shifted in his posture. Not aggression, not defiance. Readiness. "I won't speak unless you want me to," he said. "But if they cross a line tonight, I won't pretend it didn't happen." That felt fair, more than fair. Dinner progressed with the same polished indifference I'd grown used to. Toasts were raised, compliments exchanged, money pledged with smiles and handshakes. At one point, Charlotte stopped by again, wine glass in hand. "Everything okay over here?" she asked sweetly. "Yes," I said, meeting her eyes. "Perfect." Her gaze flicked briefly to Daniel, then away. "Good. You know how sensitive donors can be." Sensitive. The word landed differently now. I watched her walk away, the message replaying in my mind. We don't want him circulating. Not because Daniel was rude or unprofessional or embarrassing. Because he didn't fit the story they wanted to sell. On stage, my mother stood once more, microphone in hand. "I'd like to say a few personal words," she announced, smiling broadly. My chest tightened. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, his thumb brushing my knuckles once. Steady. My mother's eyes scanned the room, pausing at familiar faces, landing finally, inevitably, on me. "We're so proud," she said, "of the many ways our family contributes to this city." Applause followed. "And of course," she continued, tilting her head just slightly, "we all find our own paths." A few people chuckled, already sensing the tone. I felt it then, not fear. Recognition. This was the line. The one Daniel had warned me about. The one I had spent years bracing for. And for the first time, instead of shrinking, I sat up straighter. Because I wasn't confused anymore. I knew exactly what was happening. And whatever came next, I wasn't going to pretend it was accidental. My mother waited for the laughter to settle before continuing. She always did. She knew how to ride a room the way other people rode waves, never fighting the motion, just letting it carry her exactly where she wanted to go. Family, she said warmly, one manicured hand resting on the podium, is such a complicated thing. The audience murmured in agreement. People loved statements that sounded deep without asking anything of them. We're all so different, she went on. Different ambitions, different definitions of success. A few knowing smiles appeared around the room. My heart started to pound, slow and heavy, like a warning drum. And that's okay, my mother said lightly. Not everyone is meant to lead. Some people are meant to support. There it was. The words settled into the room like smoke. She glanced in my direction, not directly, never directly, but close enough that everyone understood who she meant. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, louder than before, less polite. I felt my face heat, but I kept my expression still. Years of practice had taught me how to do that, how to disappear while staying seated. Beside me, Daniel didn't move. My mother smiled, encouraged. And Olivia, she continued, has always had a generous heart. She cares deeply, even if her choices don't always align with practicality. More laughter. Someone clapped softly as if this were a charming anecdote. I looked around the room, at the donors who nodded along, relieved they weren't the target, at the board members who smiled tightly, calculating optics, at Charlotte who lifted her glass slightly, eyes glittering with satisfaction. This was the version of me they liked best, the manageable one, the harmless one, the one who absorbed the joke so the room could stay comfortable. My mother tilted her head, pretending modesty. And at least, she added, pausing just long enough to sharpen the blade, she found a husband. The room leaned in. Even if, my mother said with a soft laugh, we're still not entirely sure what he does for a living. The laughter exploded. Not polite this time, not restrained. Real laughter. I felt something crack. Not loudly, not visibly, but cleanly, like a bone snapping under pressure it had carried for too long. My father stepped up beside her, chuckling into the microphone. Now, Margaret, he said, playing along, be nice. He didn't stop her. He didn't correct her. He enjoyed it. Olivia has her talents, he added. Some people are builders. Others are supporters. Supporters. Again. My hands clenched under the table. My breathing went shallow, instinct urging me to shrink, to vanish, to make myself smaller so this would pass faster. But Daniel's hand tightened around mine, not protective, anchoring. I glanced at him. His expression wasn't angry. It was resolved. At the neighboring table, the woman who had recognized him earlier stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. She stared at Daniel now, openly stunned. "Oh my God," she whispered, "it is him." My father noticed the movement, confusion flickering across his face. Before he could react, Charlotte appeared at our table again, irritation flashing through her practiced smile. "What is going on?" she hissed. "Why are people looking over here?" She followed the woman's gaze, straight to Daniel. Her smile faltered. "Daniel," she said sharply, "what's happening?" He met her eyes calmly. "Nothing yet." "Yet?" she snapped. "This is not the place for—" The sound of Daniel's chair sliding back cut through her words. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Conversation stalled. Heads turned. The laughter died mid-breath. My pulse roared in my ears. "Daniel," I whispered, half instinct, half fear. He squeezed my hand once, gentle, reassuring, then stood. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and stepped into the aisle. Whispers rippled outward like a shockwave. "Who is that? What's he doing? Is he—" My father looked down from the stage, his smile faltering for the first time that night. "Excuse me?" he said into the microphone, confusion sharpening his voice. "Can I help you?" Daniel walked toward the stage with calm, measured steps. Each one felt impossibly loud. He climbed the short stairs and stopped beside the podium. "I'm sorry," my father said, trying to laugh it off. "And you are—" Daniel leaned toward the microphone. "My name is Daniel Reynolds," he said evenly. "I'm Olivia's husband." A few nervous laughs scattered through the room. My mother stepped forward quickly. this really isn't appropriate." "I disagree," Daniel said softly. The words settled over the room like a held breath, and suddenly every eye was on us, not as a joke, as a reckoning. Because for the first time that night, the room realized the story they thought they were telling had just changed. The silence after Daniel spoke was immediate and absolute. It wasn't the awkward kind, the kind people rush to fill with coughs or jokes. It was the kind that froze a room mid-thought, mid-breath. 100 conversations died at once. My father stared at Daniel as if the stage lights had suddenly gone too bright. "My apologies," he said carefully, voice tight, "but this is a private event." Daniel didn't move away from the microphone. "It is," he agreed calmly, "and that's exactly why I'm speaking." My mother stepped closer, her smile brittle now, cracking at the edges. "Daniel, this really isn't the time. We can talk later." Daniel turned his head slightly, acknowledging her without yielding. "For 5 years," he said, voice even, "I've sat quietly at your tables. I've listened to jokes about my work. I've watched you reduce your daughter to something small because it made the room more comfortable." A ripple of unease moved through the audience. My father stiffened. "Now hold on." "And I stayed quiet," Daniel continued, lifting a hand just enough to stop him, "because Olivia asked me to." He looked back at me then, not asking permission, not seeking approval, just grounding himself in the truth of it. "But tonight," he said, turning back to the room, "you crossed a line." Charlotte scoffed loudly from the front row. "This is unbelievable. Who does this guy think he is?" Daniel finally looked at her. "I'm exactly who I've always been," he said. "You just never bothered to find out." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father tried to regain control, slipping into the tone he used in boardrooms. "Daniel, clearly there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Daniel replied. The word landed harder than shouting ever could. "You've discussed my wife privately for years," he said. "Tonight I'm discussing this publicly." My mother's face went pale. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. My heart stuttered. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize it. He simply pulled out a folded document and held it loosely at his side. "I work in education," he said, glancing around the room. "You've heard that phrase tonight. You assumed it meant small, safe, unimportant." At the neighboring table, the woman who had recognized him earlier stood fully now. "Daniel Reynolds," she said clearly, disbelief in her voice, "founder of Bright Path Systems." The name moved through the room like electricity. Phones appeared, screens lit up, whispers erupted. That company was on Forbes. Didn't they just partner with the state? They're valued at— "That's not possible," Charlotte snapped. "That's a different person." Daniel smiled faintly. "It's not." My father's face drained of color. "Bright Path Systems," Daniel continued, "builds national learning platforms used by millions of students." The woman nodded sharply. 200 million valuation, she added, minimum. The room went still. My mother reached for my father's arm. "Edward," she whispered, "did you know?" He shook his head, stunned. Daniel looked directly at him. "You never asked," he said simply. He unfolded the document now. "But that's not why I'm here." He turned toward me. "The first recipient of this grant," he said, voice softening just slightly, "is the Reynolds Community Learning Initiative." My breath caught. "A $5 million commitment," Daniel continued, "to expand access to education in underserved neighborhoods across New York." Gasps rippled through the room. $5 million. Daniel lifted the paper just enough for the logo and signatures to be unmistakable. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's an investment." He faced my parents again. "You laughed at my wife," he said quietly. "You turned her work into a joke because it didn't impress you." My mother's lips trembled. "We didn't know." "You didn't care to," Daniel replied. He gestured toward me. "Olivia builds systems that work when no one is watching," he said. "She shows up, she changes lives, and she does it without applause." His voice tightened for the first time. "She is the reason Bright Path exists." The room was silent again. No laughter, no murmurs. Just truth standing under bright lights. Daniel folded the document and slid it back into his jacket. "I work in education," he said one last time. "I just happen to own the company." He stepped away from the microphone, and behind him, I stood up. Standing up felt like stepping into a different version of the room. Moments ago, I had been background noise, someone to be referenced, joked about, quietly dismissed. Now every movement I made carried weight. Chairs shifted, heads turned. Conversations that had already died stayed dead. I could feel it. The room had turned. Daniel stepped down from the stage and came to stand beside me. Not in front of me. Not behind me. With me. My mother was the first to speak, though her voice didn't sound like her own. "Olivia," she said, forcing a smile that no longer worked. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question landed exactly where Daniel's words had left it, empty and exposed. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to soften my answer. "Would it have mattered?" I asked. A murmur rippled through the room. My father cleared his throat. "Of course it would have mattered." I tilted my head slightly. "Then why did you only care once the numbers were mentioned?" Silence. Charlotte crossed her arms, eyes darting around the room, calculating how this moment would follow her long after tonight. "This is unfair," she said sharply. "How are we supposed to know?" Daniel didn't answer her. I did. "You weren't supposed to know," I said. "You were supposed to treat us like people." That stopped her. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice as if that might regain control. This didn't need to happen publicly. I met her gaze. Neither did the joke. A few people nodded. Others looked down at their plates. My father tried again, this time with the tone he used when deals were slipping. "Daniel, perhaps there's an opportunity here. A partnership. Bright Path aligns well with—" "No," Daniel said calmly. The simplicity of it stunned him. "The opportunity was years ago," Daniel continued, "when respect would have cost you nothing." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, he had no counter. Around us, the room had fully shifted. Donors who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact with my parents. Board members whispered behind hands. The woman from Bright Path, Jennifer, stood near the aisle, watching with an expression that held no sympathy. My mother's voice trembled. "Family is family." I felt something steady in my chest, not anger, clarity. "Family doesn't humiliate you for entertainment," I said. "Family doesn't decide your worth based on how impressive your spouse is." She reached for me instinctively. I stepped back. Not dramatically, deliberately. "I spent years trying to earn a version of love you only give when it looks good," I continued. "I'm done with that." The room was utterly silent now. Not uncomfortable. Witnessing. "I have a life I built without your approval," I said, "and I'm proud of it." I turned to Daniel. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak for me. He just held my hand. "If you want to be part of that life," I said, looking back at my parents, "respect is the entry requirement. Not conditional, not negotiable." Charlotte scoffed softly, but no one followed her lead. My father looked around at the faces that once affirmed him so easily. The damage was visible now. Not loud, but irreversible. "This doesn't have to end like this," he said quietly. I shook my head. It already did. Tonight just made it honest. I picked up my coat. Daniel did the same. As we walked toward the exit, no one stopped us. No security, no confrontation. Just space. At the doors, I paused for half a second. Not to look back, but to breathe. The night air outside was cool and grounding. The city hummed on, unaware, unchanged. In the car, Daniel started the engine but didn't pull away immediately. "You okay?" he asked softly. I thought about the laughter, the silence, the way the room had shifted when truth entered it. "Yes," I said, "I really am." Because for the first time in my life, I hadn't shrunk to survive a room. I had let it change instead, and nothing would ever fit the same way again. The city felt different once we left the building. Not quieter, New York never quiets, but less judgmental somehow, like it didn't care who had just won or lost inside a marble hall. Taxi horns blared. A food cart hissed as oil hit heat. Somewhere, laughter spilled out of a bar that had nothing to do with charity or legacy. Daniel drove. I watched the streetlights blur past the window, my reflection flickering in the glass, steady, unfamiliar, lighter. My phone vibrated in my clutch, once, twice again. I didn't pick it up. "You don't have to check it," Daniel said gently, eyes still on the road. "I know," I replied, and for the first time, I truly meant it. At home, I kicked off my heels and sat on the edge of the couch, suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscle or bone. Daniel brought me a glass of water and sat beside me, not crowding, not filling the silence. Eventually, curiosity won. I turned my phone face up. 19 missed calls. 12 from my mother, 4 from my father, 3 from Charlotte. There were messages, too. I opened the first voicemail, my mother's. "Olivia, please," she said, breathless. "Come back. This got out of hand. We didn't mean for it to go that far." I stopped it halfway through. The second voicemail was my father's, clipped and controlled. "Daniel seems impressive. Let's talk tomorrow. Privately. There may be ways to move forward." I deleted it without listening to the rest. Charlotte didn't leave a voicemail. She sent a text. "You humiliated the family. I hope you're proud." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned the phone off completely. "She still thinks it's about them," Daniel said quietly. "Of course she does," I replied. "It always has been, for them." The next morning, the fallout arrived without ceremony. An email, then another, then a call. Daniel took the first one while I stood in the kitchen, coffee mug warming my hands. "I'm calling to apologize," a woman's voice said through the speaker. "This is Eleanor Grant." I recognized the name immediately, one of my mother's most loyal donors. "What happened last night was unacceptable," Eleanor continued. "I had no idea your wife would be treated like that." "It wasn't your responsibility," Daniel said evenly. "I know," she replied. "But I want you to know I've withdrawn my support from the foundation. I can't be associated with behavior like that." When the call ended, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I didn't want revenge," I said quietly. Daniel nodded. "This isn't revenge, it's consequence." By noon, messages started circulating. Subtle at first, then less so. Board members asking for clarification. Donors reevaluating alignment. A meeting postponed indefinitely. My mother texted again. "Please, we raised millions for good causes. Doesn't that matter?" I typed a reply, deleted it, typed again. Finally, I sent only one sentence. "Good causes don't excuse bad behavior." The phone stayed silent after that. In the afternoon, my Uncle Henry called, the one my parents rarely mentioned, the one who'd left the family law firm decades ago to teach at a public university. "I heard what happened," he said warmly. "I'm proud of you." The words hit harder than I expected. "You are?" I asked. "I've been proud of you for years," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it without causing trouble." I closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the balcony, the city glowing below us. No champagne, no victory speech. Just quiet. "Do you regret it?" he asked after a while. I thought about the years of shrinking, the jokes, the back tables, the way I'd learned to disappear so others could shine. "No," I said. "I regret waiting so long." He smiled softly. For the first time, my family's approval didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something I'd finally set down. And as the city breathed around us, I realized walking out wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of everything that came after. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, just quieter. As if the city itself had turned the volume down, giving me space to hear my own thoughts without interruption. I went to work. I answered emails. I walked the same streets I always had. But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't bracing anymore. At the office, a colleague stopped me in the hallway. "I heard about the gala," she said carefully. "Not details, just that it was intense." I smiled faintly. "That's one word for it." She hesitated. "Are you okay?" I thought about it. Really thought. "Yes," I said, and this time it wasn't a performance. Daniel and I fell back into our routines. Morning coffee, late dinners, conversations about projects and timelines and things that actually mattered. He never brought up my parents unless I did. He never asked me what I planned to do next. He trusted that I would decide when I was ready. Midweek, an envelope arrived in the mail. Heavy, cream-colored, my mother's stationery. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the counter for hours, walking past it again and again until curiosity finally gave way to calm. Inside was a letter, handwritten, careful. She wrote about embarrassment, about shock, about not recognizing herself on that stage. She wrote that she hadn't meant to hurt me, that the room had gotten away from her, that humor had always been her armor. She didn't apologize, not really, but she didn't deflect either. At the end, she wrote, "I don't know how to fix this, but I want to learn." I folded the letter and set it aside. Wanting to learn wasn't the same as learning. Still, it mattered. That Friday, Daniel invited me to join him at a small community meeting in Queens. No donors, no press, just teachers, coordinators, parents. One woman spoke about her son finally enjoying school. Another asked practical questions about funding and access. Daniel listened more than he spoke. Watching him, I felt that same alignment again. This was the work. Later, as we walked back to the car, Daniel glanced at me. "You were quiet tonight." "I was paying attention," I said, "to what doesn't need defending." He smiled. The following Sunday, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "Olivia," a woman said, "this is Claire Matthews from the Foundation Board." I stiffened instinctively. "I wanted to reach out personally," she continued. "What happened at the gala, it raised concerns about culture, about leadership." I waited. "We're initiating a review," she said, "independent." After the call ended, I sat very still. Not because I felt powerful, because I felt finished. Finished explaining. Finished translating myself into something palatable. Finished hoping a room would eventually choose me. That night, Daniel and I cooked dinner together. Simple, unremarkable. Music playing softly. Windows open to the city. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly. I knew what he meant. "No," I said. "I regret how long I waited." He nodded, accepting that. Before bed, I finally replied to my mother's message. Not the most recent one, but the one that mattered. "I'm willing to talk," I wrote, "but not to be convinced of my worth, only to discuss boundaries." I didn't know how she'd receive it, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the answer. As I turned off the light, I realized something quietly profound. The night at the gala hadn't ended a relationship. It had ended a belief. The belief that I needed approval to move forward. The belief that silence was kindness. The belief that belonging required shrinking. I still didn't know exactly what came next, with my family, with the foundation, with the future. But I knew this. Whatever came next would happen on my terms. And that was a kind of certainty I'd never had before. I agreed to meet my parents 2 weeks later. Not because the letter softened everything, but because I no longer felt like the outcome would define me. That difference mattered more than timing. I chose the place. A small cafe on the Upper West Side, bright windows, neutral ground, no staff they knew, no audience to perform for. Daniel offered to come. I shook my head. "This one," I said. "I need to do alone." He nodded, kissed my forehead, and didn't question it. When I arrived, my parents were already seated. My mother's jewelry was understated for once. My father wore a casual jacket instead of his usual tailored suit. They looked careful. "Thank you for coming," my mother said quickly. "Thank you for meeting me here," I replied, sitting down. "We ordered coffee. No one touched it." My father cleared his throat. "We want to apologize for how that evening unfolded." I waited. My mother took a breath. "What I said on that stage, about Daniel, about you, it was wrong." She stopped there. Didn't qualify it, didn't dress it up. "That matters," I said quietly. "We didn't realize how much we were hurting you," my father added. I met his eyes. "You realized. You just didn't think it would cost you anything." Silence stretched between us. "You're right," my mother said finally. "We were careless because we thought we were safe." Safe. The word landed exactly where it needed to. "I'm not here to punish you," I said. "I'm here to be clear." They both leaned in slightly, listening. "I'm willing to have a relationship," I continued, "but it won't look like it used to." My father nodded slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means no jokes at my expense," I said. "No commentary about Daniel's worth. No positioning me based on optics." My mother swallowed. "And if we slip, then I correct you," I said. "Once. After that, I leave. No drama, no threats. Boundaries." My father exhaled slowly. "You've changed." I smiled faintly. I stopped negotiating. That seemed to land harder than anger ever had. "We want to know you," my mother said softly. "The real you. I believed she meant it. But belief didn't mean trust, not yet. That takes time, I said, and consistency. We talked for another hour about neutral things, about work but not numbers, about Daniel but not accolades. It felt awkward, unfinished. That was okay. When we stood to leave, my mother hesitated. "Can we hug you?" I considered it. "Yes," I said, but gently. She laughed, a small, surprised sound, and hugged me carefully, like someone learning new rules. Outside, the city buzzed as usual. Nothing dramatic happened when we stepped back into it, and that felt right. That evening, Daniel listened quietly as I told him how it went. "How do you feel?" he asked when I finished. "Tired," I admitted, "but lighter." He smiled. "That's progress." Later, lying in bed, I thought about the woman I'd been before the gala, the one who rehearsed conversations, measured her worth in reactions, waited for permission to take up space. She felt far away now, not erased. Integrated. One part of me wondered if my parents would change in lasting ways. Another part realized it didn't matter as much as it used to, because whatever happened next, I wouldn't meet them under the old rules again. And for the first time, that felt less like loss and more like choice. The morning light in New York has a way of exposing things. It slips between buildings without asking permission, illuminating corners people usually ignore. That morning, as I stood by the window with a mug of coffee cooling in my hands, I realized how fitting that felt. Nothing was hidden anymore. Not my parents' values, not my boundaries, not my own worth. Life didn't suddenly become easier after the meeting. My parents didn't transform overnight. There were awkward pauses, missteps, moments when old habits tried to resurface, dressed up as concern or tradition. But something crucial had changed. I no longer explained myself. At work, projects moved forward with a quiet momentum that felt earned, not performative. The community programs Daniel and I supported expanded steadily. No press releases, no galas, just classrooms filling with voices that hadn't been heard before. One afternoon, a teacher pulled me aside after a workshop. "You don't talk much about yourself," she said, smiling, "but it's obvious you care." I smiled back. "I do." That was enough. Weeks passed. Then months. The gala became a story people referenced with lowered voices, an example of how quickly power shifted when assumptions were exposed. I stopped being part of that story at all. It belonged to the room, not to me. My parents reached out occasionally. Sometimes the conversations were easy, sometimes they weren't. When a comment edged toward old territory, I named it. They corrected themselves. Not perfectly, but sincerely. Charlotte never apologized. I stopped waiting for her to. One evening, Daniel and I walked along the Hudson as the sun dipped low, the skyline stretching ahead of us, unfinished, evolving, real. "You ever think about how different things might have been if you'd stayed quiet?" he asked. I considered it. "I would have survived," I said, "but I wouldn't have been present." He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. Later that night, as we cooked dinner together, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. Not the version of myself who scanned rooms for approval. Someone steadier, rooted. I used to believe that respect was something you earned by proving you belonged. I was wrong. Respect is something you require, by refusing to stay where it's absent. That night at the gala didn't make me brave. It made me honest. Honest about what I would accept. Honest about what I would leave behind. Honest about who I was becoming. And that honesty followed me into every room afterward. Not loudly, unapologetically. I didn't need applause anymore. I didn't need vindication. I didn't need to be chosen. I had chosen myself. And that choice, quiet, firm, irreversible, became the foundation everything else stood on. Some people build legacies through money or names engraved on walls. I built mine by no longer shrinking. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough.